Hello, all, the Irrational Skeptic here, and today I am going to be doing a video on the nature of the dominant function. It is part of my MBTI Decoded series, where I go into some of the nuances of the theory and just try to take things apart in a way that leaves you with enough material to think about if you are ever looking to discover your type, or you just wanted to know a little bit more about typology, or personality. So, what is the dominant function? When you learn about the MBTI, you start to eventually wonder what all these functions mean. Are they skill sets? Do they say anything about one's ability to do things? Are they like superpowers? In this video, using information from various systems of typology, I'm going to introduce you all to a few ideas that should clear up any misconception about what the dominant function actually is. I will also go into why it might not be so obvious for you to know your type based off just observing what your dominant function is. In Jungian typology, the dominant function is the most differentiated of all the functions. But because this function is most differentiated does not mean that you have great awareness of the fact. The reason for this is that we tend to almost fully associate our vision of ourselves from the point of view of the dominant function. We do not use our dominant function, rather we are our dominant function. In Dr. Beebe's archetypal model, this function is called the hero of the story, or in the 8-function cognitive stack, the hero sits at the top. It is the function which rules from above and can therefore be akin to a god. In a sense, we see this as the supreme value in the world. We are due for a few examples that should make this clear to your inner sight. Extroverted thinking, or TE, is a function that is outward-facing in terms of energetics. Carl Jung liked to call this libido, which is just a storehouse of energy that can be utilized in the outer or inner world. In the case of extroverted thinking, the characteristics that comprise this function are an attitude of subjecting almost everything in the world to objective verification and proof. This function says we must perform empirical experiments in order to know if anything is true. We cannot trust any gut feeling or even theoretical framework over empiricism. These types can also be known as realists because to them, the external world is all there is. The interactions in this world are more or less chaotic and need to be subjected to the power of man to come under control. They find proof in this when they see the wind blowing and rain pouring, for example. Then they say we should build a house in order to shelter ourselves from this rain. When this occurs, their function has good feedback in saying that we have control over certain factors of reality which we can manipulate to our own ends. Einstein's theory of relativity was not respected by most scientists of his time because it seemed like something he just came up with. It wasn't until the predictions that his theories made were shown in the real world that did the extroverted thinker actually believe him. After figuring out the use cases of such information, creations such as the atomic bombs started to materialize. The TE user normally takes things that work and use it towards communal or societal ends. This is because within the cultural soup, the dominant function works on behalf of society. There is a two-way relationship going on here because this function gives the most rewards from society to the individual when used in its service. So, people are encouraged to maximize its usage, but of course at the expense of the other very real functions that comprise your personality. This process leads to certain kind of one-sidedness, which can be seen in many archetypal personalities that use their dominant functions to its ultimate end. For example, Alexander the Great was most likely an ESTP. He literally conquered lands as a continual exercise because to him, his hero's duty was to overcome the world and assume control over the physical forces. Second example. Another example is that of introverted sensing. This function is highly attuned to epistemological evidence of living. They really do prize what is known as tried and true methods of living. You can find this representation in a society in a type like the ISTJ. Wherever you find this type, you will likely see them following the rules, because for them, why else are rules there except for them to be followed? They usually see intuitives as crazy at best. How can one go off into the world without a plan of action that has not been shown to be true? This just doesn't make sense to them. It is safer to just continue taking the same old route to work rather than trying a new way which might get them lost or make them run into traffic. Even worse, they might run into an armed robber that will take all their money. No, really, this is unfortunately a possibility that these types unconsciously entertain. This is because the dominant function is opposing to an almost unconscious process of extroverted intuition. They really do not trust this function, and because of the attitude of the dominant, the inferior is seen as a pesky little baby that won't shut up. Unfortunately, because of the one-sidedness of the dominant function, the inferior decides to draw upon an unconscious powerhouse of energy in order to project itself into the world. And this gives rise to a major reason why it may be difficult for you to notice what your dominant function is. Your inferior function, for the most part, colors the world. The dominant function cannot easily be known to you because you are the dominant function. There can be no other way of being except through this prism, because it just makes sense. It is not something you are consciously deciding to use. When an ISTJ is telling you that maybe you should just follow the rules, it is from the very core of their cognitive processing. They are actually commanding you to follow the rules and not really giving a suggestion. The ego is so bound up in this function that it believes that this is just how I am. Rather, they usually identify with more of their creations through the auxiliary function. So, instead of the ESTJ, for example, thinking that they are trying to impose order upon the world, they will usually think that they are just playing it safe and using the most true and tried methods of being. While in their dominant mode of being, if one was to remain in the same orientation, that is, being introverted or extroverted, they would start to loop with the tertiary function. For the ESTJ, the tertiary function is extroverted intuition. So they would be looping on extroverted thinking and extroverted intuition, which leaves them in an extroverted mode, which is their primary favorable mode of being. They will be carrying out a multitude of possibilities in the external world that is circumscribed by the mission or goal of the dominant function. A concept I learned from Socionics Model G is that the dominant function sets the goals of the personality. It does not necessarily implement these goals using the same function. Rather, they use the auxiliary function's opposite vertness to implement their dreams. In the MBTI, this is known as the sixth function, which is known to carry very powerful unconscious influence. For example, an ENFP may see themselves as being very extroverted feeling in their interactions with society, smiling and laughing a lot, therefore creating an environment of harmony where it becomes easier to mold the world into what they like. Think about it like this. If you have pieces of clay scattered all over the place, it will be hard to create anything without first combining these pieces of clay together. So what the extroverted intuitive with feeling, ENFP, does is bring the pieces of clay together, which in this case is human beings. Then they mold this clay into whatever form they have conceived to be their life's mission. Well, I'd like to stop this video here. I've given you a few things to think about when it comes to analyzing the dominant function. I've given reasons why it may be hard to even notice this function, given that we implement them in various ways that have nothing to do with the function itself. It serves as a kind of God, which needs to be praised and appreciated for the goodness it bestows upon the world. And in this lies our greatest danger. Because if you follow this to its ultimate conclusion, you'll see how one function can predominate the world and eventually suppress others unwittingly. An extroverted thinking world, for example, would make all introverted feelers feel persecuted on a daily basis. This will not necessarily be because these types are consciously suppressing an introverted feeler, an INFP or an ISFP, but because it's being done unconsciously. But that's a video for another day where I will cover what the unconscious really is. That will probably be a multiple part series, as it is very dense material that will require me to give many examples to build a theoretical framework where I would like to play. And so that's it for now. Until next time, the Irrational Skeptic signing off.